Hi guys. Laura's behavior began to shift so subtly that I might have missed it if I hadn't been paying attention. At first, it was little things that seemed innocuous but collectively nagged at the back of my mind. She started paying more attention to her appearance, something that hadn't been a priority since we had settled into the comfortable rhythm of marriage. Suddenly, she was up at dawn curling her hair, experimenting with bold lipstick, and swapping her usual casual clothes for tailored skirts and high heels. I initially chalked it up to a new year, new resolutions. Who wouldn't want to spruce themselves up occasionally? But then there were the late nights. Her job, a predictable 9 to 5 at an accounting firm, suddenly became this all-consuming whirlwind of urgent deadlines and team brainstorming sessions. She'd text me at the last minute to let me know she wouldn't make it home for dinner, promising to grab a sandwich or something between spreadsheets and audits. At first, I didn't suspect a thing. We all have busy seasons at work, right? But it wasn't just the hours. My Laura, was different. We used to spend our evenings together, curled up on the couch, laughing over silly TV shows. That stopped. Even when she was home, her head was somewhere else. She seemed distracted, her phone glued to her hand, often tilted just slightly away from me. I'd ask her what was so engrossing, and she'd laugh it off, saying it was just a group chat with her colleagues or some irrelevant TikTok trend. The turning point came one Friday evening. I had planned a surprise date night, something we hadn't done in months. I made reservations at her favorite Italian restaurant, even picked up her favorite flowers. When I told her about it, expecting that warm smile of hers, she froze. For a moment, she looked panicked, before quickly recovering and mumbling something about a work dinner she had completely forgotten about. The explanation felt rehearsed, her tone too casual to be genuine. That night, I didn't let it slide. I sat up waiting for her to come home, nursing a glass of scotch, the bouquet of flowers wilting on the counter. When she walked through the door, the faint scent of perfume not hers and the smudged lipstick sent a pang through my chest. "How was the work dinner?" I asked, forcing a smile. She hesitated, the pause too long to be anything but guilt. "It was fine. Same old corporate nonsense," she replied, avoiding eye contact as she slipped out of her heels. That's when the doubts began to fester. The next day, I started paying attention, really paying attention. Her phone, always face down. Her laughter, a little too forced. The way she suddenly had Spotify playlists filled with romantic ballads and moody rock, genres she had never cared for before. I caught her staring off into the distance during family dinners, her fork twirling idly in her pasta as if she was lost in some secret daydream. The first undeniable clue came when I decided to clean out her car. Laura was notoriously bad about keeping it tidy, and I figured it would be a nice gesture. Under the passenger seat, I found a receipt for a dinner at an upscale bistro I didn't recognize, dated on one of those nights she had claimed to be working late. 2 entrees, a bottle of wine. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Who was she dining with? The spiral continued. I started noticing other inconsistencies. One evening, she came home wearing a silk scarf I had never seen before. When I complimented it, she looked startled, mumbling that it was a gift from a coworker. Another time, she accidentally left her laptop open on the dining table. I glanced at the screen, my heart sinking when I noticed a draft email addressed to someone named Ryan. She quickly shut the lid, laughing nervously and saying it was nothing important. It all came to a head during a weekend when Laura announced she needed to go on a team-building retreat with her colleagues. I wanted to believe her, to trust her, but the gaps in her stories were becoming too wide to ignore. I decided to do something I never thought I would: check her phone. While she was in the shower, I unlocked it, my hands trembling. The messages were there. Buried beneath her usual chats was a thread with a contact saved as R. It didn't take long to piece things together. The conversations were laced with inside jokes, playful teasing, and even a few photos that made my stomach churn. "I can't wait to see you," one message read, followed by another that said, "Last night was perfect." When Laura emerged from the bathroom, her cheeks flushed from the steam, she found me sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in my hand. Her expression shifted from confusion to panic in a matter of seconds. "What's this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The silence that followed was deafening. Laura didn't try to deny it. She just stared at me, tears welling in her eyes. "Adam, I can explain," she began, but I couldn't hear it. I didn't want to hear it. Her behaviors, the small changes I had dismissed, all clicked into place. The gym membership she suddenly insisted on renewing, the new lingerie tucked away in her drawer, the way she had started humming around the house as if some invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. All of it had been signs I had been too blind, or too trusting, to see. I sat there, the room spinning around me, trying to process the betrayal. How had we gotten here? How had the woman I loved, the woman I had built a life with, drifted so far from me? And worse, was this my fault? Had I failed her in some way? The moment I found the receipt for that bistro, a weight settled in my chest, but it wasn't the only thing. Over the next few days, my world became a puzzle made up of fragments, small, seemingly unconnected details that, when pieced together, painted an unbearable picture. One afternoon, I came home early from work, an unusual occurrence given my own busy schedule. Laura wasn't expecting me. Her car was still in the driveway, and the house was quiet. I thought she might be napping, but as I walked in, I noticed something odd, a shopping bag from a high-end boutique on the kitchen counter. Laura wasn't one for expensive brands. She'd always said they were a waste of money. Curious, I opened the bag to find a sleek, black dress, the kind meant for evenings I hadn't been part of. Alongside it was a pair of designer heels, the receipt tucked inside the box. The total was jaw-dropping. We shared finances, but I hadn't seen this on any of our bank statements. That's when it hit me. She must have used a credit card I didn't know about. I felt sick. It wasn't the cost, it was the secrecy. Laura wasn't just changing, she was hiding parts of herself from me. The black dress, the heels, they weren't for work dinners. I'd have known if her office had started hosting galas. These were for someone else. I decided to dig deeper. That evening, when Laura left her phone on the nightstand to shower, I reached for it again. This time, I wasn't just looking for texts, I went into her emails. What I found wasn't incriminating on the surface. Confirmation emails for hotel bookings in the city, bills for meals at restaurants I'd never heard of, but none of it involved me. She was careful, erasing replies and incoming messages, but the breadcrumbs were there if you knew where to look. There was even an email about a spa day, a package for two. We hadn't been to a spa together in years. I felt like a criminal, going through her things. It wasn't who I was. But every time I tried to confront her outright, she dodged me, changed the subject, or acted like I was imagining things. Her growing caution with her phone didn't help. She'd started keeping it on her at all times, even taking it with her when she went to the bathroom. If I asked to borrow it for something simple, a quick Google search or to check a notification, she'd tense up, make an excuse, or rush to do it herself. One evening I tested her. We were sitting on the couch, a movie playing in the background, when I casually asked to use her phone to check the weather. She froze, her hand hovering over the bowl of popcorn between us. "Why don't you just use yours?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes darting to her phone, face down on the coffee table. I shrugged, playing it off. "Mine's charging," I said. She hesitated for just a second too long before handing it over. Her screen was locked, of course, but what struck me was how she watched me like a hawk the entire time, as if expecting me to snoop. The tension was palpable. I didn't even unlock it. I just handed it back and pretended not to notice her sigh of relief. Later that week, I took the investigation further. I logged into our shared credit card account and cross-checked the statements. I knew what was ours: groceries, utility bills, takeout from the local pizza joint. But then there were charges that stood out. High-end steakhouses, wine bars, boutique hotels. None of these fit our usual lifestyle. I scrolled through the months, my stomach tightening with each unfamiliar name. This had been going on for longer than I realized. Still, part of me wanted to believe there was some other explanation. Maybe these were for work. Maybe I'd misunderstood. But deep down I knew the pieces were too consistent, too damning. The Laura I thought I knew would never lie to me, not like this. One Saturday, when Laura said she was going to a yoga class, I decided to search the house. It felt like a betrayal of trust, but I needed to know. I started in our closet, combing through her side. Among her usual clothes, I found items I hadn't seen before, lingerie that was far too revealing for someone who claimed to be too tired for intimacy, expensive blouses still with tags, and a clutch purse that reeked of someone trying to impress. Then I noticed a shoebox tucked behind her winter coats. Inside, I found receipts, ticket stubs, and a few photos. None of them featured her with anyone else. She wasn't careless, but they were damning nonetheless. One receipt was for a jewelry store, with a handwritten note that said, "You deserve this," scrawled on the back. It wasn't in my handwriting. By now, my suspicions had hardened into certainty. I started paying closer attention to her comings and goings, tracking her stories against the evidence I'd gathered. She wasn't sloppy. If anything, her lies were meticulous. But lies have a way of unraveling when you start pulling at the threads. The tipping point came when I decided to follow her. I didn't want to. I hated the idea of spying on my wife, but the alternative was sitting at home, driving myself insane with what-ifs. One evening, when she said she was meeting a friend for drinks, I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. I kept my distance, trailing her to a trendy bar downtown. She parked, got out, and walked inside. For a moment, I hesitated. What was I even looking for? Proof? Closure? But as I watched her greet a man at the bar, a man who wasn't me, I realized it didn't matter. The truth was already there. I didn't plan on finding the messages. I wasn't even looking for them that evening. It started when I sat down at our shared laptop, intending to pay a few bills and sort through some emails. Laura was out again, citing another late-night work meeting. The house was silent, the faint hum of the dishwasher in the background. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I logged into our account, but then something stopped me, a notification in the corner of the screen. An email client was open, and Laura's profile was still logged in. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. We trusted each other, or at least we used to. But something about the email preview caught my eye. A thread titled, "Miss You Already Red Hearts?" The sender's name was Richard. Richard, her boss. The man she had casually mentioned a few times over the years, always in passing, always as a professional figure. He'd never been someone I'd thought twice about. But now, his name sat there, glowing on the screen like a taunt. I hesitated for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I shouldn't invade her privacy, I told myself. But wasn't my privacy, my trust, already shattered by everything I'd found? My fingers moved almost on their own, clicking on the thread. What I saw made my stomach drop. The messages weren't just flirtatious, they were explicit. Their tone was playful and romantic in places, raw and passionate in others. He called her darling, beautiful, and my escape. She responded with equal fervor, using pet names I thought were reserved for me. They joked about their secret meetings, reminiscing about dinners at places she'd never taken me, describing moments of intimacy that made my skin crawl. One message from Richard stood out. "Last night was unforgettable. Seeing you in that black dress, God, Laura, I can't stop thinking about it. You're incredible. Can't wait for next Thursday." I stared at the screen, bow rising in my throat. The black dress. The one I'd found in the boutique bag. The one I hadn't seen her wear for me. The thread was long, too long for me to process all at once. I scrolled further, my hands trembling as I absorbed fragments of their conversations. There were references to work as a convenient cover, inside jokes I didn't understand, and a thread of arrogance that stung deeply. They weren't just cheating, they were laughing about it, enjoying the thrill of secrecy. It was bad enough reading their words, but then I found the photos. They were tucked into an attachment Laura had sent him under the pretense of important files. There they were, candid shots of them together. At a bar, leaning into each other like giddy teenagers. In a park, her head on his shoulder. And worst of all, in a dimly lit hotel room, his hand resting possessively on her thigh as she smiled into the camera. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out my insides and left me with a shell. These weren't just images, they were evidence of a life she'd been living without me. A life that wasn't supposed to exist. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen. My mind raced through a storm of questions, none of which had answers. How long had this been going on? Did she ever feel guilty? Was it something I did, or didn't do, that pushed her away? But the messages didn't speak of guilt. They spoke of excitement, of passion, of a connection that I wasn't part of. In one message, Laura had written, "Sometimes I feel like a different person when I'm with you, Richard. Like I'm free. Like I'm who I'm supposed to be." What did that make me? Her cage? Her warden? The man who provided stability while she chased the thrill of something new? The words blurred on the screen as tears stung my eyes. I hated her in that moment, but I hated myself even more for not seeing it sooner. As I scrolled back through their exchanges, I realized just how calculated Laura had been. They used code words, discussed alibis, even mocked how oblivious I was. One particular line from Richard stuck out, "You're lucky Adam trusts you so much. Most guys would be suspicious by now." That's what I'd given her, and she turned it into a weapon. I felt foolish, betrayed, and humiliated all at once. The woman I'd built my life with, the woman I still loved despite everything, had been lying to my face for months, maybe even years. I couldn't look anymore. I closed the laptop and pushed it away, as if the physical act of distancing myself from it could make the pain go away. But it didn't. The images, the words, they were burned into my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him. Every time I thought about our marriage, I heard her laughing at me with her boss. The worst part was knowing she'd walk through the door later that night, acting as if nothing was wrong. She'd kiss me on the cheek, ask about my day, and climb into bed beside me as if our world wasn't falling apart. I didn't know how I'd face her. I didn't know if I could. When the sound of her car pulling into the driveway broke the silence, I felt a wave of panic. My hands shook as I debated what to do. Should I confront her? Show her what I'd found? Or should I wait, bide my time, and gather more evidence? A part of me still wanted answers, even if I already knew the truth. A part of me still clung to the hope that this was all some terrible mistake. But deep down, I knew there was no mistake. The truth was written in every word, every image, every lingering glance, and unexplained late night. The Laura I thought I knew was gone. In her place was a stranger, someone who had shattered our life for reasons I might never understand. After that night, I wasn't sure what to do next. Sitting on the knowledge of Laura's betrayal felt like a slow poison, but I couldn't rush into confrontation, not yet. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Laura's messages with Richard weren't just an affair. They hinted at something deeper, something tangled up in their work. That's when I decided to reach out to someone I'd never expected to ally with. Sarah, Richard's wife. I'd met Sarah a few times at company events Laura had dragged me to. She was poised, intelligent, the kind of person who could make conversations seem effortless. I couldn't imagine how she'd react to what I had to say, but I knew I had to tell her. She deserved to know just as much as I did. I tracked her down through social media and sent her a cautious message. "Hi, Sarah. This is Adam, Laura's husband. I need to talk to you about something important regarding Richard and Laura. Please let me know if we can meet." To my surprise, she responded almost immediately. "What's going on? You're scaring me." We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe the next afternoon. I didn't sleep that night, rehearsing how I'd tell her, wondering if I was making the right choice. When she walked into the cafe, I could tell she was nervous. Her eyes darted around until she spotted me, and she came straight to the table. "Adam," she said, sitting down. "What's this about?" I took a deep breath, my palms sweating. "I'm sorry to bring this to you," I began, sliding my phone across the table, the screen displaying one of the damning messages between Laura and Richard. "But I think you deserve to know the truth." She read the message, her face paling. Then she looked up at me, her expression shifting from shock to anger. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know exactly," I admitted. "But I found messages, photos, enough to know it's not a one-time thing." Sarah leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. For a moment, she looked like she might cry, but then her expression hardened. "Richard's been acting strange for months. I thought he was just stressed about work. I even asked him if something was going on, and he swore he was just tired. We sat there for hours, sharing what we knew." Sarah told me about Richard's recent mood swings, his late nights at the office, and his sudden enthusiasm for expensive gifts she'd never received. In return, I showed her everything I'd uncovered, emails, receipts, and photos. Together, we pieced together a timeline that confirmed what we both dreaded. But as we talked, another layer of the story emerged. Sarah mentioned that Richard had been handling significant accounts at their company, and some of his decisions had raised eyebrows among his colleagues. There were whispers, she said, people wondering if he was skimming from bonuses or funneling company money into personal expenses. That struck a chord. Some of the receipts I'd found on Laura's email, dinners, hotel stays, and even spa treatments, didn't make sense on her salary alone. If Richard was using company funds to bankroll their affair, this wasn't just personal, it was criminal. We decided to dig deeper. Sarah was reluctant at first, afraid of what we might uncover, but I reminded her that we deserved the truth, no matter how ugly it was. Over the next few weeks, we shared information discreetly. Sarah had access to Richard's work emails and accounts, and I continued monitoring Laura's communications. What we found was worse than either of us had imagined. Richard had been embezzling funds from the company for months, funneling money into personal accounts and using it to lavish Laura with gifts. There were expenses tied to weekend getaways, high-end jewelry, and even a down payment on an apartment in the city, a place I'd never heard of before. As the pieces came together, so did our resolve. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. Richard and Laura had betrayed us both on every level, emotionally, financially, and morally. We needed to act. One evening, Sarah and I met at her house while Richard was away on another business trip. She showed me emails she'd printed, highlighting evidence of his financial misconduct. This could ruin him, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. If we take this to his company, they'll investigate. Do we want to go that far? I asked, unsure. Exposing the affair was one thing, but destroying Richard's career and potentially dragging Laura down with him felt like a step into dangerous territory. Sarah met my gaze, her eyes unwavering. He's a liar and a thief, Adam. He's hurt us both, and he's risking his company's future. If we don't do something, he'll keep getting away with it. She was right, of course. The anger and betrayal burned too deeply to ignore. We spent the next few days compiling everything we had, emails, receipts, bank statements, and even photos. Sarah contacted a lawyer, someone she trusted, to advise us on how to proceed. He assured us that the evidence was solid and suggested we present it to Richard's company anonymously to avoid potential backlash. The tension in those days was unbearable. I still hadn't confronted Laura directly, and every moment we spent together felt like a lie. I'd catch her smiling at me across the dinner table, and all I could see was the woman in those photos, laughing with Richard while my world crumbled. The night before we sent the evidence, Sarah called me. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. There was a tremor in her voice, as if she was second-guessing everything. "I'm sure," I replied. "They've taken everything from us, Sarah. It's time to take something back." The next morning, we submitted the evidence to Richard's company through an anonymous tip line. Within hours, the ripple effects began. Calls, emails, a sudden flurry of activity as the truth started to unravel. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. The confrontation wasn't planned, not exactly. It had started as an idea tossed between Sarah and me, something we joked about in moments of frustration as we pieced together our shattered lives. But as the evidence mounted and the weight of their betrayal became unbearable, the idea took shape. It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about taking control of a situation where we'd both been left powerless. We chose the restaurant carefully, a high-end spot downtown, one that Laura and Richard frequented. Sarah had found reservations under Richard's name for a Tuesday evening, a regular date night they'd managed to disguise as working dinners. When Sarah told me, her voice was tight with anger and determination. "If they want to play house in public," she said, "let's give them an audience." The plan was simple. I'd show up with Sarah just as Laura and Richard were settling into their table. No yelling, no dramatics, just the truth, laid bare for everyone to see. That evening, I dressed in a suit I hadn't worn in years, the fabric stiff against my skin. Sarah met me outside the restaurant, her expression a mask of cool composure, though I could see the tension in her clenched fists. "Ready?" she asked, her voice steady but low. "Let's do this," I replied, though my stomach churned with nerves. We walked in together, the host greeting us with a polite smile. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his tone implying he doubted it. "We're meeting someone," Sarah said smoothly, scanning the room. Then she saw them. Over there. They were seated near the back, tucked into a corner as if they owned the place. Laura's laugh rang out, too loud and too carefree, while Richard leaned in close, his hand resting casually on her arm. They looked like they didn't have a care in the world. That changed the moment they saw us. Laura's smile froze, her hand gripping the edge of the table. Richard's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he sat back in his chair. For a moment, no one moved. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, the kind that couldn't be ignored any longer. "Mind if we join you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm as I pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting for an answer. Sarah followed suit, her movements deliberate as she slid into the seat across from Richard. "What the hell are you doing here?" Richard hissed, his voice low but sharp. "Just wanted to catch up," Sarah said, her tone deceptively light. "It's been too long since we've all been in the same room, hasn't it?" Laura looked at me then, her eyes wide with a mix of panic and guilt. "Adam, this isn't—" "Don't," I cut her off, my voice firmer than I expected. "Don't insult me by pretending I don't know exactly what this is." The silence that followed was deafening. Other diners were beginning to notice, their curious gazes darting toward our table. Laura shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Richard glared at me, his eyes filled with a rage that barely masked his fear. "We know everything," Sarah said, leaning forward. Her voice was quiet, but her words cut through the tension like a knife. "The messages, the photos, the hotel bookings. And, Richard, let's not forget your little habit of using company funds to pay for your extracurricular activities." Richard's face went pale, the blood draining from his cheeks. He opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it, glancing nervously around the room. He was a man used to control, used to power, and now he was trapped, exposed in front of strangers. "Laura," I said, turning to her. "How long were you going to keep lying to me? How long were you going to sit across from me at dinner, smile at me, and pretend everything was fine?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might actually apologize, but the words never came. "Let's make one thing clear," Sarah said, her gaze fixed on Richard. "We're not here for explanations or excuses. We're here to make sure you both understand what you've done." Laura finally found her voice, though it was shaky and uncertain. "Adam, please, let's talk about this at home. This isn't the place." "This isn't the place?" I repeated, my anger bubbling to the surface. "And where was the place, Laura? The hotel rooms? The restaurant dates? Or maybe our bedroom while I was out working to support us?" Her face crumpled, and she looked away, unable to meet my eyes. Across the table, Richard's composure was unraveling. He leaned toward Sarah, his voice a harsh whisper. "You're making a scene." "No, Richard," Sarah shot back. "You made the scene. We're just here to make sure it's properly documented." The tension in the room was electric. Diners were no longer pretending not to watch, their conversations fading into a dull hum as they focused on our table. The humiliation was palpable, written across Laura and Richard's faces as they squirmed under the weight of our words. "Here's how this is going to go," I said, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Sarah and I have all the evidence we need of your affair and your financial misconduct. You have a choice. Come clean to your company and your families, or we'll do it for you." Richard's eyes darted to Sarah, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Sarah, please. Don't do this." She didn't blink. "You brought this on yourself." With that, we stood up, leaving them sitting there, exposed and powerless. As we walked out of the restaurant, the whispers and stares followed us, but I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The fallout began almost immediately. By the time Laura returned home that night, the wheels were already in motion. I didn't bother staying up to talk to her. I had nothing left to say. Instead, I slept in the guest room, locking the door behind me. In the days that followed, the consequences of their actions began to unravel their carefully constructed facade. The first domino fell at Richard's company. Sarah and I had anonymously submitted the evidence of his financial misconduct to the board of directors, along with proof of his affair. It didn't take long for them to act. A corporate investigation was launched, and within days, Richard was suspended from his position. The details weren't made public, but word traveled fast in professional circles. His name, once synonymous with success and power, became a cautionary tale. Laura wasn't spared either. Her employer got wind of the scandal through whispers and rumors, and while the company didn't have direct proof of her involvement in Richard's financial crimes, the association alone was enough to call her ethics into question. The day she came home clutching a cardboard box filled with her belongings, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't satisfaction, exactly, but it wasn't pity either. She looked at me as if she expected comfort, but I couldn't muster any. They said they needed to let me go to protect the company's reputation, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not fair. I said nothing. What could I say? She had thrown away everything we'd built together for the fleeting thrill of a man who had destroyed her life as thoroughly as his own. The social fallout was just as swift. Laura's friends, the ones who used to crowd our home for dinner parties and girls' nights, vanished. Some stopped answering her calls, others sent curt messages explaining they didn't want to be caught in the middle of her mess. Even her closest confidants, the ones she'd likely bragged about Richard to, distanced themselves. The whispers about her weren't just about the affair, they were about how recklessly she had gambled with her career, her marriage, and her reputation. Richard fared no better. His colleagues, once eager to be in his orbit, now avoided him like he was contagious. The investigation into his finances revealed more than we'd anticipated. He had been siphoning funds not just for Laura, but for other personal indulgences. Vacations disguised as work trips, extravagant gifts charged to company accounts, even an attempt to claim expenses for the apartment he'd rented in the city. The company pressed charges, and soon Richard was facing the possibility of jail time. When Sarah told me about the charges, she sounded conflicted. I didn't think it would go this far, she admitted. But maybe it's what he deserves. I agreed silently. Richard had built his career on deception, using people as pawns in his climb to the top. If his fall was hard, it was only because he'd climbed so high on the backs of others. Laura's financial situation deteriorated quickly. Without her job, she struggled to maintain the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to. The expensive clothes, the luxury spa days, the fine dining, all of it was suddenly out of reach. She turned to me one evening, her face a mask of desperation. Adam, she said, her voice trembling. Can we talk about us? About fixing this? I stared at her, trying to see the woman I had once loved. But all I saw was the betrayal, the lies, the choices she had made that had led us here. There is no us, Laura, I said quietly. Not anymore. She cried that night, but her tears didn't move me. They felt like too little, too late. Sarah and I stayed in touch throughout the fallout, united by the strange bond of shared betrayal. She told me about the adjustments she was making, how she was focusing on rebuilding her life. It's strange, she said once. After everything, I almost feel free. Like I've been carrying this weight for so long, and now it's gone. I knew what she meant. There was a kind of clarity that came with losing everything you thought you knew. It was painful, but it was also liberating in its own way. For Laura and Richard, however, there was no freedom, only isolation. They became pariahs, not just professionally but socially. Richard's trial loomed on the horizon, and with every passing day, his chances of escaping unscathed grew slimmer. Laura, for her part, seemed to drift further into herself, retreating into the shell of someone who had once been vibrant and full of life. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they weren't speaking anymore. Whatever spark had drawn them together had been snuffed out by the harsh reality of their circumstances. Without the secrecy, without the thrill, there was nothing left to sustain them. They had ruined their lives for a fantasy, and now they were left with nothing but the wreckage. As for me, I began to pick up the pieces of my own life. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything threatened to crush me. But slowly I found my footing. I went to therapy, reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with, and started to rediscover the things that made me happy outside of my marriage. One day, I ran into Sarah at a cafe, both of us alone and carrying the quiet confidence of people who had survived something unimaginable. We sat together, catching up on each other's lives, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. "We made it through," she said, raising her coffee cup in a mock toast. "Barely," I replied with a small smile. But as I clinked my cup against hers, I realized she was right. We had made it through. And for that, I was grateful. Goodbye.